And hello to everybody out there. Thanks. And not just like in the past, they would be like, oh, this poor deaf person. Now they're just an everyday person. There's a motto that comes from disability rights movement that says nothing about us without us. So if you...
Hello everyone, this is Side by Side, and continuing on last episode, Jami Fisher. This time we'll talk about the status quo of deaf communities around the world and the varieties and dialects in sign languages, as well as the controversial opinions towards the usage of cochlear implants. So without further ado, let's get started. We've just talked about like the division between the hearing world and the deaf society, and you have to like constantly switch between them. And next, could you share a bit stories that related to your experience when you are like the bridge?
Sure, it happens a lot. Like, for example, none of my hearing family members really sign. I mean, my son can sign. My dad's mother is still alive. She never learned how to sign. His family never learned how to sign. My mom's family never learned how to sign. She doesn't have any brothers or sisters. So anytime we would come together, I was always the one that would do the interpreting. Now my younger brother, he is an interpreter. So he's taken on some of that responsibility. And I think he doesn't feel as burdened by it. It's not as hard for him. But at the same time, both of us, sometimes we switch off because both of us want to enjoy our Thanksgiving, for example, and don't want it to feel like work. So that's always hard. I think that's the hardest thing for me. I'm sort of used to navigating, like hearing people coming in and not understanding how to interact with a deaf person. Like that stuff doesn't bother me as much as the families coming together. That's hard for me.
I want to ask a bit about the deaf community as a whole. Like, what's their situation in US right now? What's the situation of the deaf in the entire world right now?
Right now, I'm teaching a special course called a Penn Global Seminar, where students are learning about different deaf communities around the world. But Penn will be taking us to Italy, where we learn about the Italian deaf community. They were the last country in the European Union to have their sign language recognized officially. But so I wanted to take the students to sort of as a case study to understand that. So that's something that I'm teaching now. I'm going to go globally, and then I'm going to focus more nationally and even locally. So it really depends around the world what rights deaf communities have. And each community, I would say, not even in each country, but different countries have different communities that have really different experiences depending on money or particularly education access and what kinds of access are provided in education. So, for example, is the education provided in sign language, in the sign language of the deaf people? Sometimes there are countries that still don't focus on the sign language. They focus on oralism and using speaking to teach, which is not accessible usually to deaf people as readily. Some countries have like recognized legal rights and protections of deaf people. Sometimes those laws are there, but they're not enforced as well. So it really depends on how much, I'd say, education and power and awareness deaf communities have and the ability they have to get the information out to the community members. In the United States, as I mentioned earlier, we've had the Americans with Disabilities Act law that passed in 1991. That law really provides an enormous amount of protection and rights to deaf people and all people with disabilities, but deaf people in particular. It's what allows them to require interpreters that they don't have to pay for in all settings in order to gain access to the spoken language. Education is supported by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act that started in 1974, but now it's evolved and added to consider like what the needs of deaf people would be. This is not just for deaf people, but people, all children with disabilities. So that provides special access to interpreting in educational settings, and deaf people depending on their education plan, could be expected to be educated in a school for the deaf rather than in what we call a mainstream school with their other hearing peers, depending on what their needs are. So that's really important. And I would say, as you saw, the movie CODA got such recognition. More and more people want to take American Sign Language. They know about deaf people. It's not like they've never seen a deaf person. Even if they never met a deaf person, they maybe have seen them on TV. I think deaf people are more and more integrated into popular culture, and not just like in the past, they would be like, oh, this poor deaf person. Now they're just an everyday person. And so I think that's really positive, especially with CODA being recognized. People are taking American Sign Language sometimes in high school, but a lot in college. There are opportunities like we have at Penn. And then I'd say locally, what I've been working on, my students have the opportunity to take an ASL and Deaf Studies minor, and we really work closely with what the deaf, they work in and with deaf community members in Philadelphia to support their organizational efforts and to be another resource. But what I work on in my research is to document the Philadelphia area variety of American Sign Language. In the US, different schools for the deaf, like all of the American Sign Language comes from one place, which was the original school for the deaf in Hartford, Connecticut. And then different teachers went and started different schools. So they all start, with the same base language, but then the language changed a little bit because the schools for the deaf would have these deaf people and they would sort of make their own varieties, like people who come together when they have spoken language, they start to sound a little bit differently than somebody in another community elsewhere. So but that variety of Philadelphia area variety is sort of dying off because the older generations and the younger generations don't have the same opportunities and experiences to keep them going. And also we have the internet and video calls and travel that's much more possible than there was, even 50 years ago or 25 years ago. So we're documenting the Philadelphia area ASL in what we call the Philly Signs Project or Philadelphia Signs Project. And so you can see different varieties of signs in our website as well. So I hope that was a good overview.
And regarding on that varieties of sign languages, did you face any challenges or communication problems, specifically when facing different dialects in sign languages?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, you'll see that a lot. Sometimes it's strange because there are different varieties all over the United States, but Philadelphia always had this reputation for being weird or different or unintelligible or something like that. So we're still trying to understand why that is. But people would some of the videos that we've recorded that are on our website talk about what happens to deaf people when they would go to other meet people from other communities, whether they would go to a different school for the deaf in Washington DC, where it's a national school, so a lot of people from different areas would go, or to Gallaudet University, which is the deaf university in Washington DC. When they would come together and meet other deaf people, they would say, deaf people would be like, what are you talking about, or what are you signing? And it sort of makes them feel critical of themselves, of thinking oh, maybe I'm only going to use this when I'm with my Philadelphia friends and family. And so you see a lot of that. And I think we see a lot of what we call convergence, where it's oh, nobody really wants to be seen as different with their language. So they sort of unconsciously start to sign the people who are around them. So that's partly why we're seeing Philadelphia area signs and other dialects sort of fading as well.
I've never known that there is a lot of varieties in sign languages, and you've also talked about some accessory technologies that help deaf people to adapt to the hearing society. I want to know more about what's the authentic opinions or perspective of deaf people on those accessories.
That's a great question. So cochlear implant is like a really visible tool that parents, I mean, essentially you have to have, typically hearing parents are the ones who decide to give their children a cochlear implant. And a cochlear implant is not an amplification tool like a hearing aid. It just makes things louder. Cochlear implant doesn't do that. It's an implant in the brain, which like bypasses the ear. And so it's like your brain is hearing rather than your ear is hearing, and then transmitting it to those signals to the brain. So we're not like born to do that. So it's something that once you get the implant, then you have to have a lot of therapy in order to learn how to hear through your brain. But it's complicated because, not because a deaf child belongs to a deaf community or a hearing community from birth. Like, I think there is some truth to that. With respect to cochlear implantation, I think it's important to know that even though a person has a cochlear implant, they're still deaf. Like, they have to take off the processor and charge it every night. And when they do that, they have no hearing. Like, and in fact, the cochlear implant destroys any residual hearing that is left. So that's something to be aware of. So the real controversy, I think, with cochlear implants is there is like a medical perspective that deaf people are like sort of broken hearing people, and we have to fix them and make them as hearing as possible. But that's not really sort of understanding and accepting the person as who they are and what abilities they do have. So I'm going to get back to that. But the problem is that sometimes they say, okay, don't sign with this child, because then they're going to prefer to sign and not speak, and then they won't be able to speak as well and things like that. But the problem with that is that, like, our brains have a limited amount of time to grow and learn a language. And if we deprive a child from language, from birth, then they're going to be what we call language deprived or delayed. So that's important. That's one thing that's connected to cochlear implants that is a problem, because it's not a problem with the implants. It's a problem with how families are being told to use them. Is the only tool, rather than also incorporating a sign language. But deaf people, like, for example, my family, my brother was born to, and I am born to, two parents who have sign from the beginning. So he was never language deprived because he had language from birth. He had exposure to it. My parents signed to him. He could see language happening around him. But babies who don't have that opportunity, who aren't exposed to sign from birth, and sign language would be the language that is available to them, then they have real risk of language deprivation, which has really lifelong consequences in education and in social and language development. But like, I want to emphasize that cochlear implant is just one tool available to deaf people. Like, now with technology, we're using one tool right now. Like, the video technology is something that we can use to call people. Also, there's an app called Cardzilla. And it's like very simple, but what it does is you can like either type in a message and have the person, like the hearing person, read what the deaf person is thinking. And also Cardzilla can like listen to what's being said and then just transcribe it, so that it's sort of as a mediator for people who don't use the same language. And there are a lot of other technologies. There's something really cool called the Motion Light Lab. It's at Gallaudet University. And what they do is they create signing avatars that like sign to like stories, like of deaf stories and books. So that's something really cool to look at. So I think, like, while cochlear implants get a lot of attention, I think there are a lot of tools and technologies that can support the lives of deaf people without sort of like intervening and feeling like they need to be fixed.
One last question today. How can the hearing people help to raise the awareness of the entire deaf group? Or do hearing people actually need to be involved in deaf communities, or raising awareness and stuff like that?
I think that's a wonderful question and a great place to wrap up. I think that hearing people are definitely needed because deaf people are a minority, and they need support of like what we call allies in the hearing community to support their efforts. So we always need hearing people to be aware of, and as much as possible be involved in learning the sign language of deaf people, and importantly to listen to deaf people and their perspectives. And there's a motto that comes from disability rights movement that says nothing about us without us. So if you are interested in working on a project that has to do with deaf people, find a deaf person and get them involved so you can have their input and understand what is really wanted and desired and applicable and relevant to deaf people before you start creating ways that you think deaf people need help. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think that's all for today. Thank you for sharing your experience.
Of course, Kyrie. And hello to everybody out there. Thanks, Kyrie. I really appreciate your questions.